Hello, everybody. This is your host, Ira Deshpande, and welcome to The Brown Noise, a podcast where brown girls turn up the volume and talk about things that need to be spoken more about. Today, we're diving into a topic that's only just beginning to get the attention it deserves: ADHD, especially in South Asian women. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a condition that affects focus, impulse control, emotion regulation, making it difficult to plan, organize, and achieve goals in one's day to day life. Despite growing awareness, ADHD remains significantly underdiagnosed in women. The Journal of Psychology recently found that on average, women face a 4-year delay in diagnosis compared to men, if at all they do get one. This is due to differences in how symptoms present and how they are perceived by clinicians, families, and even the women themselves. In South Asian communities, the silence around neurodivergence can be even louder, often buried under stigma, gender expectations, or the pressure to just fit in. So stay tuned as we talk to three incredible guests today: a student living with ADHD, a therapist who works with neurodivergent South Asian women, and a researcher studying diagnostic trends and gender disparities in ADHD. So let's get into it. Before we dive into research and the clinical side of things, let's start with a personal story. I spoke to Aisha, a college student who lives with ADHD. She talks about what her diagnosis means to her, how she realized she had it, and what's it like navigating it all as a young South Asian woman. Thank you so much for joining our podcast today and sharing your experience with us. Let's just start simple. What made you think that you might have ADHD?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honestly still learning how to talk about it, and to answer your question, I think I've always felt it, but I didn't have the language to understand what it was. As a child, I would say I daydreamed a lot, and teachers would complain about how distracted I was. But I think because I always managed to get good marks, nobody suspected anything that was wrong. In university, though, things changed. I genuinely couldn't cope. A friend of mine saw me struggling and then suggested that I see a therapist. I was really skeptical at first, but then I'm so glad I did it. Um, yeah, that's how I think I would say I've got to know about all of this.
Yeah, I think it's incredible that you did seek help, but when you do kind of speak about being skeptical about seeking help or seeing a professional, even though you were struggling, where do you think that came from?
I think growing up in a typical Indian household, we never really speak about mental health and the issues that we're struggling with. So if you are struggling, it just meant that you had to focus more or stop being lazy. And as a girl, there's extra pressure to help around the house, be calmer or quieter, the typical good Indian older sister, you know. And growing up,
Yeah.
I aspired to be that. Also, nobody around you really never talks about any mental health challenges, so you start believing that if you just work twice as hard, you'll be fine. You're taught to basically just push through. So yeah, going to a psychiatrist is out of the question.
Yeah, and I want to kind of focus on the good Indian girl that you kind of mentioned and aspire to be, who's calm and quiet and put together. Did that aspiration create challenges for accepting your ADHD?
Absolutely, yeah. In our culture, there's a very definition of a very good child or a very bad child. A good child is somebody who is good at academics and obedient, and I wanted to be that. For girls, there's also this added layer of being marriage material, like, there's really made to feel like an ultimate goal in life. In such situations, you're scared of something being wrong or different about you, as in going to like reflect your personality poorly or your parents poorly, because there's so much stigma around it. It's that fear that made me seek help that late, when I was literally drowning, rather than much before, when it could have helped me really grow up as a person.
Talking about getting a late diagnosis, how did your diagnosis sort of help you, and what's your journey been after getting a formal diagnosis?
It was like I got a manual for my brain. I was so scared to tell my parents initially about how they would react, but they've come around. I've taken meds, I go to therapy. They both helped me show up better in my day to day life. Learning about my diagnosis has been life changing. I no longer think that I'm lazy or overdramatic. The way my brain works isn't abnormal, it's just different. So I'll say this: I wish more people knew about ADHD, so it doesn't feel like an excuse or something you have to explain for those around you. I still have bad days, but I think in the last year or so, I've learned how to be compassionate about myself, to myself, and that's made all the difference in the world.
While Aisha's story isn't uncommon, it's also not something we get to hear very often. And that's partly because ADHD doesn't always show up the same way in men and women. In fact, studies show that women are 3 times less likely than men to be diagnosed with ADHD in childhood. So, what does that mean in therapy rooms today? I asked Janvi Murray, a therapist based in New Delhi, India, who works with many women navigating their ADHD journey. Thank you so much for talking to us today, Janvi. I think while we're trying to understand the plight of women with ADHD, it's important to kind of see how their symptoms show. And could you tell us a little bit more about that and if they're any different in men and women?
Yeah, there definitely are differences. So, as people become adults, the symptoms of ADHD tend to become a lot more similar, but we see these major differences when they're children, right? So, for boys, we do see a greater chance of them being diagnosed with ADHD because it's a lot more visible, it's a lot more disruptive in a class. So, it's more of like a difference between a child who cannot sit still. You'll be able to notice that child a lot more than a child who's just quietly daydreaming. Both are having troubles focusing on the task, right? But there'll be one that'll be a lot more visible, and the other one that will not be, which is basically girls. And that's why these symptoms tend to become a lot more similar in adulthood, and that's why we don't see a lot of difference in terms of diagnosis in adulthood. But yeah, we do see those differences a lot more with children.
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of girls sort of go undiagnosed when they're younger, and while they become adults, the ratio kind of proportions itself out, right?
Absolutely.
When they do decide to come in for therapy, which I'm guessing is a lot in adulthood, what are some of the patterns that you tend to notice when women with ADHD actually come in?
So it does present itself as some other kind of mental health condition, right? So a lot of them come up with anxiety, right? So there's this sense of chronic overwhelm. They're missing deadlines, they're missing appointments, they're forgetting their phone. Or there's some anxiety around social settings. There's this fear of rejection, or they might also come with just difficulties in relationship and attachment. And I think a good clinician can sort of detect and understand that these could be signs and symptoms of ADHD. If a clinician is not trained enough, they'll not be able to detect this or understand this.
Yeah, and I think, do you think that culture has some sort of role to play in this also, especially for more conservative cultures like South Asian, and how do they affect women in particular?
When we're speaking about women, I think a lot of cultures, and like you mentioned, South Asian culture, right? They can place a lot of onus on women to be caregivers, nurturing, to be more organized, to be on the top of their game, to be someone who makes home feel like home, right?
Hmm.
So a lot of onus is put upon women in these cases, and it can affect women in two ways. I think it can promote masquerading of certain symptoms, which then again goes under the radar or goes undetected in childhood and adulthood. And it can also lead to disapproval because women then, if they are appearing to be forgetful, disorganized, and inattentive, and that's not regarded as being the perfect woman according to your culture, again, there can be a lot of disapproval with regards to
A-
people around you.
And do you think like shame also plays a huge role in this when women do feel ashamed that they're not able to sort of live up to the ideal standards?
Yes, absolutely. I think shame plays a huge role in this. And I think that shame can kind of turn two ways, right? On one hand, you might also sort of see some women with ADHD becoming a lot more perfectionistic in the ways
Hmm.
in which they're kind of carrying themselves to combat that shame, to combat that feeling of not ever feeling enough. Or it could also go the other way, where there's these features tend to become a lot more prominent as a sort of rebellion towards culture, right? So yeah, it does
Hmm.
play a huge role.
And lastly, what's the one thing you wish more people understood about ADHD in women as a therapist?
I think it's really important to again understand it can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. I think it's also very important to know that even if you're not able to understand someone with ADHD or a woman with ADHD, it's really important to just accept them as they are. It's important for them to also access spaces where they're able to, because this is a very, I would say it's not a very well researched area yet. So it's important for them to find spaces where they're able to kind of understand, relate to other women. So these can be found in self-help groups, support groups, in therapists, in psychiatrists, or any other sort of mental health support space, really.
And that brings us to the question, why are so many women only learning about ADHD in adulthood? Is the diagnosis process itself flawed? Is research even keeping up? To understand where the gaps begin, I spoke to Dr. Sandhya Basu, a researcher working on cognitive psychology, especially among children with ADHD and autism. Thank you so much for joining us today, Sandhya, and kind of helping us see the bigger picture when it comes to diagnosis in women of South Asian descent. Uh, let's start with something basic but crucial. Do we have enough reliable data on ADHD in South Asian women, or are we still sort of missing a huge part of the picture?
So we are definitely missing a huge chunk. Most research is based on school reports or clinical referrals, and girls who often don't show the typical hyperactive signs just don't get referred at all. So yeah, the data sadly ends up underrepresenting an entire gender.
Yeah, you're right. And have sort of more studies in South Asia focused solely on boys, or has the gender gap in diagnosis like been explored recently?
The focus has mostly been on boys or what's called gender neutral data, but even that is dominated by boys. Girls are underrepresented in both research and diagnosis. That I think is a big reason as to why most people still associate ADHD with boys because it's all we've seen for years. It's very recently that we started even talking about ADHD in women. So, yes, we need a lot more gender specific data to sort of change the narrative.
Yeah, and this gap that you kind of spoke of right now, it has consequences, right? Because a lot of women only get diagnosed as adults after years of having issues such as like anxiety or depression.
Exactly. And often that anxiety or depression is caused by their untreated ADHD in the first place. So, studies actually show many women who come in for other mental health issues had ADHD all along. The gap is really wide, that even trained professionals have missed it. And the person who loses out is the child who could have gotten help years and years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I think that sort of really, focuses on the main point of all of this is that what we're missing is an early diagnosis. But before we wrap up, what's one thing about ADHD in women that you kind of think of needs to be talked about more, especially by people outside of academic spaces, like parents and teachers?
Wow, great question. So we can start by just understanding that ADHD isn't something crazy. It's simply a different way of functioning. There's plenty of research that shows this, but honestly, who outside of academic circles is even reading it? In cultures like ours, the stigma is also so strong that people end up pretending they're fine until they reach a sort of breaking point. I think the real focus should be on building enough awareness in parents and teachers to be able to spot the signs so young girls aren't suffering in silence. And yeah, hopefully get the necessary help and support they require to thrive.
Listening to our guests, one thing seems clear. This isn't just about misdiagnosis, it's about who gets seen and who doesn't. The president of the American Professional Society for ADHD recently revealed that as of 2025, there is less than 1% of published ADHD research dedicated to women. And even fewer studies take race, ethnicity, or cultural context into account. That means that we're still playing catch up with science, with systems, and with the language we need to describe our own minds. These intersections matter: gender, culture, and neurodivergence. All of it shape how we're understood or often misunderstood. When you grow up being told to stay quiet, to behave, to cope in silence, ADHD doesn't always look like chaos. It looks like exhaustion, overcompensation, and holding your breath. But the more we speak, the less we stay hidden. This is Brown Noise, where brown girls turn up the volume and talk about everything that matters. Thank you so much for listening, and see you next week.